Lecture 7, Aristotle, Metaphysics, Professor Philip Carey.
Great minds, Aristotle. Talk about a great mind. He would be my candidate for the greatest mind that ever lived. Think about the achievements of this man. In addition to being the second most important and influential philosopher in the Western tradition after Plato, he also invented the science of logic. Think of that as an achievement. One man basically invented logic. He's not the first person to think logically, but the first person to formulate the rules of logic and give it a name. And he didn't stop there. He invented physics. That is, he formulated physics as a branch of human inquiry and gave it its name. I mentioned earlier he gave the name to the inquiry called metaphysics. And in a substantial sense, he invented the sciences of zoology and botany as a branch of human investigation and inquiry. He started a whole bunch of things. His mind was large enough to start logic as a form of discipline and inquiry, logic on the one hand, and botany on the other. Imagine a mind that large. It's awesome to read Aristotle, to encounter an intelligence that great. Aristotle was not only the second most influential philosopher after Plato, he was also Plato's student. He came to Plato's academy as a young man. The academy is the very first academy. Plato's academy is the first thing to be called an academy, except for an olive grove outside of Athens, which was the original academy. Plato bought that olive grove and used it as the place of his school, and that's why it's called the academy. So the very first academy is Plato's academy, and the greatest student in that academy is Aristotle. And it must have been a remarkable place, because Aristotle came into that academy and seems to have been a critic of Plato's pet theory. The key theory of Plato's metaphysics, the theory of the forms, which we talked about in the previous lecture on Plato, Aristotle seems to have been a critic of that theory from the beginning. There are disagreements, actually, about the history here, but I take the view, along with many other scholars, that Aristotle came into the academy and from the beginning was a critic of Plato's theory of forms. He was the son of a doctor, a physician, and he knew about inquiry into the physical or natural world. And he wanted for philosophy to be concerned with those things. He wasn't so impressed with this otherworldly stuff, these eternal things which you can't investigate with your hands and eyes and ears. So Aristotle was looking for basically a theory that would help us understand things that grow and change, things like human bodies, things like botany, zoology. And his criticism of Plato was that this theory of forms is great as something to contemplate, I guess, but it doesn't help explain the changing world. And this is summarized in a wonderful painting, which is actually right behind me here in the studio. This is a painting by Raphael of the Academy. And there's Plato and Aristotle. And Plato is here pointing upwards at the world of the forms. And Aristotle is arguing with him, and his hand is pointing forward. Look out there, Plato, he's saying. Look out there. This is what we need to understand. Looking up there doesn't do it. Maybe there's forms up there, but, what we need to understand is here. We need a science of changing things, an understanding of how things change and grow. The word for this is physics. Physics is a word that more or less Aristotle invents as a word for a certain kind of science. It comes from the Greek word physis, meaning nature. And a nature or a physis is a certain kind of thing. When you say, what kind of thing is that in Greek? You say, what physis is it? What kind of thing is it? The root sense of the word physis is from a verb phuo, meaning to grow. So you're asking, what kind of growing thing is it? How does it grow? How does it come into being? How does it change? What's the rules and laws of its changing and growing? What kind of thing is it? That's what physics is about, is how things move and grow and change according to their own nature. Right? It's natural for a stone to fall. That's its natural movement, right? This is natural when the stone falls, when the coin falls to the ground. It is natural for an animal to grow from infancy to an adult form. It is natural for fire to go upward. It is natural for human beings to reason. That's what we need to understand, Aristotle thinks, is how these changes and growth and movements happen. Now, the Greek term for science, as in science of physics, is knowledge, right? The Greek term science means knowledge. So the phrase the science of physics in Aristotle's Greek would mean something like the knowledge of growing and changing things, the knowledge of what kind of things growing and changing things are. Or you could say the knowledge of moving things, if you use the word movement in Aristotle's sense. Here I need to talk about a sort of an enlarged sense of the word movement. Aristotle's word movement is a general term which includes all kinds of growth, right? So a child growing up is moving from childhood to adulthood. And Aristotle will call that a movement in that sense. Whereas movement in space is what Aristotle translators will call locomotion. Locomotion, change in place. Local motion, change in place. So local motion or locomotion is not the only kind of motion for Aristotle. Movement includes growth, and even growth in understanding. So with this broad concept of movement, what we can say is physics for Aristotle is the science of movement. It's a knowledge about processes of change in the natural world. It's the sort of thing that the forms can't give us, because the forms are unchanging, right? The forms might tell us something about the world maybe, but they don't tell us about the changing world. And in fact, Aristotle's key point is that the forms don't exist separate from the changing world, right? Plato was wrong about that, Aristotle thinks. He corrects Plato's theory of forms, insists that the forms are not separate from this changing world. The forms are embodied in material things. That's Aristotle's theory of form. And that's where we can start in trying to understand Aristotle's metaphysics. Aristotle is starting with Plato's theory of forms and criticizing it. And basically what he's trying to do is bring the forms down to earth, right? Just like in the picture, right? Plato's pointing upward, Aristotle's pointing to this world, the world of changing things. He's saying that's what we need to understand. That means form has to be part of the changing world. It has to be embodied in matter. Now, matter itself is an interesting word. It's a word that could also be translated material, right? Matter is the stuff out of which something is made. It's the material out of which something is made. As a house is made out of wood, right? The wood is the material of the house, or the matter of the house. So for Aristotle, a thing of this world, a natural thing, and all natural things are changing things, right? Nature means a world of things that change. Well, a natural or changing thing is going to be a composite or compound, he'll say, of form and matter, right? It'll be something which has a form, which is made out of something else. So a house is a form, right, which is embodied in wood, right? Let's suppose we're talking about a wooden house. The wood is its matter. It's what it's made of. But the house is the form, because the form is what it is, right? A pile of wood is not a house, right? So you can't tell what a house is just by saying it's wood, right? If you say that house is wood, you've said what its matter is, but you haven't said what its form is. You haven't told us its structure or what its purpose is. So in order to say what the house is, you need to say not wood, but house. So house designates a form, whereas wood designates matter or material. By the same token, then, the form designates the essence or nature of a thing, right? What is that? It's a house, right? The answer to the question, what is it, is the form, which Aristotle will also call the essence, right? The what it is house. The what it's made of is wood, right? And so matter is what it's made of, form is what it is. Now, this is going to take a little working through, because this is foreign to us in some ways, but when you put it all together, it makes a lot of sense. So let's think again about the house, which is not exactly, of course, a natural thing. It's an artificial thing, right? That's a distinction we get from Aristotle. There's natural things, there's artificial things. And the difference is that natural things grow, like a baby animal becoming an adult animal, whereas Artificial things are made by an artist. The fundamental contrast here is between art and nature, Aristotle will say. And he's using the word art in the original Greek sense, techne, he calls it. Art does not mean just fine arts, or beaux-arts, as they would say in French, the beautiful arts, right? Art is not just about making beautiful things, it's also about making useful things, like houses, right? So the house is an object of art, is a product of art for Aristotle. And when he says that, he's not speaking metaphorically, that's just literally how you would say it in Greek. The house is a product of art. We would say it's artificial, right? It's not natural. And the person who makes the house, a carpenter, say, is an artist. Right? In the literal Greek, that's what you could call a carpenter. Right? That's foreign to the way we talk. But for Aristotle, it's perfectly natural to call a carpenter an artist. Right? An artisan, say, we would now say. So the house comes to be through a process that is governed by an artist. Unlike a natural thing. Right? There's no artist that makes an animal. Right? There's an artist that makes a house. That's the difference between things that are made by art and things that are made by nature. And the reason I started with the example of a thing made by art is because that's actually simpler. Nature is more complicated. And what Aristotle really is doing, I think, and many people agree with me about this, he's taking how things work with art and using that as a metaphor or a model for how things happen in nature. Both in art and nature, what something is its form. What it's made of is its matter, right? So the house is made of wood. You and I are made of flesh and bone, but we aren't flesh and bone. We are human, right? The human is the form. That's what we are. Likewise, the house. It's made of wood, but it's not just wood, right? Because a pile of wood is not a house. So the form, the notion of form is what I'm trying to elucidate here. It's a very complex notion. We might say, in contemporary English, the structure of the house is what makes it a house, right? It's got to have walls and dwelling places. But you're also going to have to refer to purpose, and we'll get to that in a minute. So in order to focus on form or essence, and for Aristotle, form and essence are the same thing. They define what something is. You have to know something about its purpose, its structure, and form is a lot like structure. And then you can go on and mention its matter, what it's made of, because every form has to have its appropriate matter. You can't make a house out of any kind of material at all. You can use wood or metal, stone, but you can't use wax or water. So form and matter go together, but the form is what defines what something is. And that's what Aristotle will call essence. Right? Form and essence are two ways of talking about the same thing. Essence is a translation of a phrase in Aristotle that means the what it is. The what it is for it to be is the essence. So what it is for something to be a house is the form of a house. So you may yet, we're a little confused yet. Don't be surprised if this is hard to follow at this point. You can only quite understand Aristotle by the time you get to the end of it. But we're trying to get at this notion of Aristotelian form. Right? It's not disembodied like Plato's form. It's somehow there where you can see it, like the form of a house. It's related to structure. It's related to purpose. But it's not the same thing as what something is made of. Right? Okay, so let's now take the huge step from talking about artificial forms to natural forms. Oh, one more thing. The form of the house can exist separate from the house. Right? Here's the last thing I need to say about art. The form of the house can exist in the mind of the artist, in the mind of the carpenter, sort of like a blueprint in your head. That would be the same form, Aristotle thinks, as the house itself. Right? And that elucidates a lot about what form is for Aristotle. The form of the house embodied in the material is the same form as the form in the artist's mind. Exactly the same form. Right? That's what form is, Aristotle thinks, is that thing in the mind which is also in the wood. Now, that's form in art or artificial things. Now we can make the big leap. Form in nature. And especially now, form in living things, in things that grow. Right? The house comes into being by a process that isn't exactly growth. It's something like growth, but it's superintended by this artist. And the natural thing grows by its own power, by its own nature, an internal principle of growth. That means that the form in a natural thing is not in the mind of an artist. The form is intrinsic, internal to the organism. Right? Think about a living thing now. We're talking about, say, a baby animal. a puppy, right? It's got this form called dog, right? It is a dog. A dog is not the same thing as what a dog is made of. A dog is not the same thing as flesh and blood, right? Think of what would happen if the dog died, right? You'd have flesh and blood, but not a living dog, right? Here we have a key notion. When you have a corpse, right, flesh and blood but no life, what you have is the matter or material of a living thing, but not its soul, not its essence or form. And so, Aristotle identifies the form of a living thing with its soul, its life. Right? The word soul, psyche, in Greek, can be translated life. It often is, also in the New Testament. The word life and soul those two words can be used to translate the same thing, psyche. The difference between a corpse and a living thing is that a corpse doesn't have its psyche, its soul, right? And therefore doesn't have its essence, because the corpse of a dog is not a dog, right? It's just flesh and blood. Just like a pile of wood is not a house. So the form of a living thing is its soul. That's also its nature. Another way of putting it is, the dogginess of a dog, the thing that makes a dog, is its soul, which is also its nature. Likewise, the humanness of a human being, the thing that makes you human and not just a pile of flesh and blood that's a corpse, is your soul. That's your essence and your nature. Right? Human nature is soul. Human nature is essence, the human essence. Now, something to realize here about souls. Once again, as so often in Aristotle, we're using words in a different way than we're used to in the 20th century. For Aristotle, every living thing has a soul, because the soul is the life of something. So plants have souls, right? No one would have been surprised in ancient Greece when Aristotle said this, right? Because soul simply meant the life of the thing. So a plant has a soul, but what a plant doesn't have is a rational soul. Most of the time nowadays when we talk about souls, we're thinking of rational souls, right? Immortal souls, those Platonic souls. But for Aristotle, every living thing had a soul, because what happens when soul is separate from body is that you have a corpse, right? So animals had souls, plants had souls, human beings had souls. But they had different kinds of souls. Only human beings had rational souls, souls that could reason and think. And that's why human beings are called, by definition in Aristotle, rational animals. Right? There's other kinds of animals out there that aren't rational, like my dog. She's not a rational animal. She is an animal. She does have a soul. Not an immortal soul, right? But not a rational soul. She can't think and understand and do mathematics and all that sort of stuff. But what can she do? She has what's called a locomotive soul, right? Like all animals. She can move around, unlike plants, right? Plants don't have locomotive souls. Animals do. Here, I'll have to add another piece of technical terminology. My dog is not just an animal, she's a brute or a beast. That's the word for a non-rational animal, right? One that runs around and perceives and eats, but can't do the higher functions of thinking, can't do mathematics, can't perceive form, really. So animals have souls that can move around, that can eat, but not souls that can think. Animals, I should say brutes, right? We're animals, we can think. But the brutes can't think, but they can move around. So they have locomotive souls, you could say. And plants have nutritive souls, because they can't move around. They're not locomotive. They can't change around in place. But they nourish themselves. Well, not exactly eat, but they take in nourishment, and they grow. Right? So souls are defined by the kind of things they can do, the kind of growth and movement they're capable of. Right? Plants are not capable of movement around in place or locomotion, but they are capable of growth. Animals, brutes, are capable of running around, and therefore of locomotive motion, but not of reasoning. And human beings are the rational animals. So the nature of something is defined by its capacities for movement, or growth, or change. The capacities for movement, growth, or change that are inherent in it. That's what a nature is. And that's also what a soul does when it's mixed with a body, right? And that's why one can talk about a form embodied in matter, right? Because the key example of a form embodied in matter is literally your soul in your body. Your soul, which keeps your body alive, right? Without soul, your body is a corpse. With soul, your body does what living human bodies can do, including walk around, eat, drink, think. Okay. Now, At this point, we've got, about 75% of Aristotle's notion of form. Let's now launch into the key sort of formula for Aristotle's physics. He talks about 4 causes. That's what I mean by the key formula. Aristotle's physics, or science of moving things, is organized around these 4 causes. And 2 of them we've already talked about, form and matter. Right? And we'll get back to them again. Form and matter are 2 causes, Aristotle calls them. He actually, what he says is they're modes of explanation. Right? If you want to say, what is that? Or why is that so? Actually, the proper question here is, why is that so? You can refer to the form, or you can refer to the matter, or you can refer to 2 other things. And let me get to those 2 other things. If you want to ask, why is something like that, one thing you could do is talk about the cause in the narrow modern sense. Right? Aristotle has 4 causes. We really only have 1. That's the cause of being or motion. When we talk about cause and effect, we're talking about one thing that makes another thing happen. Aristotle calls this the cause of being or movement. So, for instance, if I throw a ball, I'm the cause of that movement. That's not a formal cause or form. That's not a material cause or matter. That's what the later Aristotelian tradition will call efficient cause. That doesn't mean it's really, really efficient. It means that it has an effect. It has a cause and effect relation. The cause and effect relation for Aristotle is what he calls efficient cause. It's only one of the 4 causes. The efficient cause is something that brings something else into being or causes it to move. So when I throw a ball, I'm the efficient cause of the ball's movement. If I'm the carpenter, the artist building a house, I'm the efficient cause of the house. And if I'm a parent, I'm the efficient cause of that child. I have set that child's growth in motion by begetting that child. Right? I'm the source of the motion of the child that's called growth. Remember, growth is a form of movement or motion. And the source of that growth or motion is the parent. Right? And that's how the child gets the form of humanity, from his or her parent. Likewise, the puppy gets the form of dogginess from his or her parent. So that's an efficient cause. Parents are efficient causes. Artists are efficient causes. People who throw balls are efficient causes. And that helps then to be a key part of Aristotle's explanation of how change happens. Right? You've got to have that picture of cause and effect in order to explain what change is and how it happens. But that's only 1/4, one of the 4 causes. It's not the whole explanation. Unlike modern physics, where in certain versions of materialistic physics in modern thought, efficient cause is what it's all about. Right? Well, not in Aristotle. Efficient cause is only part of the story. We also have form and matter. And now the last cause that I haven't mentioned is final cause, it's called. These names, efficient cause, final cause, and then formal and material cause, that's the 4 causes. These names were given after Aristotle. Aristotle didn't actually use these terms. Final cause is the old traditional word for what Aristotle calls the end, or technically, that for the sake of which something happens. The end for Aristotle does not mean just the termination. It means the completion of a process or a movement. Like the house, which is the completion of the process of building a house, right? The movement of that house as it gets built. And for Aristotle, that's a movement, right? The movement is aimed towards the complete house. The complete house is the end of that movement, both in the sake of sense of the termination, but most fundamentally in terms of the goal, right? The complete house is the goal of the process of building, and that's what Aristotle means by end. Likewise, the adult form of an organism, the adult dog, is the end of the process of growth that starts when a puppy is conceived. Likewise, the adult human being is the end, the goal of physical growth. So this final cause is called final because it designates an end of a process. An end of a process conceived as the goal of that process. And notice, it's closely connected with the notion of form. Right? In order to understand a form, you have to understand it as the end of a process, the goal. Right? Forms are goals. Right? The house, the form of the house, is the goal toward which a carpenter is working when he's building the house. The adult form of the dog is the goal of that process of growth. And adult humanity is the goal of the process of physical growth. We'll talk about the goal of mental and moral growth in the next lecture on ethics. Okay, so In order to understand Aristotle's form, then, his notion of form and how he's changing it from Plato, you have to connect it with this notion of efficient cause, or cause of motion, like a parent causing the growth of a child by begetting the child, getting that process of growth started. And in addition to efficient cause, you have to have final cause. You have to explain things in terms of their end or purposes. And then you have to, in addition, have these things that we've talked about before, the matter and the form. The traditional name for matter is material cause, not Aristotle's term, but the traditional Latin phrase, causis materialis. And then the word for form is formal cause. So there's the four causes: formal cause or form, material cause or matter, efficient cause or cause of motion, and final cause or end or purpose. So the form of a house is house. The matter of a house is wood. That's the material cause. The efficient cause is the artist or builder, the carpenter. And the final cause is the purpose of the house, the form of the house considered as the purpose of the process of building. So the final cause and the formal cause can overlap very dramatically, very firmly. Likewise, the process of natural growth. The parent is the efficient cause, the adult form is also the final cause, and the flesh or body is the material cause. So you see how these four causes work together to give an explanation of how things change and grow and move. That's what Aristotle was after. So that's what Aristotle thinks makes a big improvement on Plato and all previous forms of thought. Aristotle sort of summarizes all of Greek thought up to his time and says, look, they all had part of it right. Thales said that all the world is made of water. Well, he's just talking about material cause. We need to talk about formal cause and efficient cause and final cause. Plato talked about form. That's great, but we need to talk about efficient and final cause. You've got to put it all together and you get physics, as Aristotle conceives it. One more crucial element in the scheme: potentiality and actuality. Notice the relation between child and adult, which is so important for Aristotle's understanding of nature. The child is potentially an adult. Right? When you deal with a child, you have to deal with how the child actually is at present, but you also have to deal with the child's potential. Right? It would be terrible if you treated a child as if the child would never grow up. Right? Education is treating a child in light of its potential for becoming an adult. So movement is this process in which the actual is in some way already potentially present. The child is not just this dawdling, babbling kid who doesn't understand much. He's going to become an adult, and you have to treat him or her in such a way as respecting that fact and dealing with that fact. So movement is this process from potential to actual. And in a sense, when you're in movement, you have both the potentiality and the actuality in you, and the actuality is in you potentially. And the form is what governs that transition. Right? The house, when it's being built, is moving towards the complete house. The infant animal is growing towards the adult form. Therefore, the form is already there. Right? The puppy is already a dog, but it's there in the form of potential, which therefore motivates growth. So, in a sense, in all natural movement, things come to be where they belong. They reach their potential. That even happens in physical movement, what we now call physical movement, like when a stone drops, because the natural place for a stone is down on the earth. That's how gravity works. Fire goes upward because the natural place for fire is up there. So there's natural movements all over, not just the natural movement of growth from childhood to adult, but the natural movement of inanimate objects. As the stone falls, the water falls, the air rises, the fire rises. So the whole world, for Aristotle, moves according to final causes, purposes. The whole world is oriented towards achieving forms, achieving purposes and ends. The whole world moves in a purposeful way, unlike modern physics, where things happen just because of efficient causes or formulas or whatever. Right? In modern physics, when movement happens, it's not for a purpose. Necessarily. Most of the time it's not for a purpose, right? That's the physical laws. But in Aristotle, things always move toward an end, if they can. Sometimes they're forced to move against their end. Sometimes a stone doesn't fall but goes upwards because I'm throwing it upwards, but that's against its nature. And its nature eventually takes over and it falls back down. Right? Things go where they belong. Things head toward their proper end. So Aristotle's physics is a teleological physics, a physics in which things head toward their telos, or telos, which is Greek for end. Things have a purpose in Aristotle's world. So it's still a metaphysical world, right? A world where form, true being, determines what things are and are to be. But well, it's not Plato's world. It's not quite so otherworldly as Plato, but it's also more purposeful, right? In a sense, more meaningful than in modern physics, right? All movement has a purpose, an end, a meaning. So it's a different world, Aristotle's world is, than modern physics.